23rd of June, 2016. A date that will go down in history. On that day, 51.9% of British people voted to leave the European Union. The divorce had been confirmed. Brexit would become a reality, which of course is exactly what happened. But do you remember what the main promises of the pro-Brexit campaign were? Well, there were many. But this was by far one of the most important and decisive.
I am making one very simple point. We cannot have any form of managed migration into Britain and remain a member of the European Union because we have an open door to nearly 500 million people.
Brexit is only way to control immigration, campaigners claim.
In fact, as you can see, polls prior to the referendum clearly showed that the vast majority of Britons, whether they were Brexit supporters or not, believed that Brexit would allow the British government to take back control of the borders and thus reduce the huge number of immigrants that were entering the country. Brexit entailed many things, but electorally speaking, it mainly involved controlling immigration and the effects that would have on the health system, schools, the labour market, and the daily lives of the British people. Well, since then, no less than 7 long years have passed, and the question we can ask is, what exactly has Brexit meant for immigration? Has it really delivered on this promise? Well, VisualPolitik community, the data seems to say something very different.
24 November 2022, UK immigration nearly triples despite Brexit promises. 8 July 2023, Channel migrant crossings hit new daily record for 2023.
The immigration debate has become one of the central issues at 10 Downing Street. Despite the fact that the United Kingdom can now manage its borders again, the arrival of immigrants has not only decreased, but has actually increased. And this despite the fact that the economic situation in the country is not particularly good. So the question we're all wondering is, to what extent has the UK become a country open to immigration? What has happened to what was one of the great promises of Brexit? Did you know that Sunak's team hopes to make immigration, or rather the fight against immigration, its big political bet in the run-up to the next elections in 2025? Well, in this video, we're going to learn all of the details about the huge wave of immigration that the UK is experiencing. So, let's get started.
Open the gates.
VisualPolitik community, it is impossible to talk about the UK post-Brexit without mentioning Alexander Boris Johnson. You know, Bojo, Boris Johnson? Yeah. That guy, the same guy who was able to offer tea to journalists in the morning, struggle with an umbrella in the middle of the day, and placate children during rugby matches in the afternoon. That has got to be one of my favorite clips. In short, one of the most colourful and controversial characters in modern politics, Britain Trump. A politician who was one of the great advocates and promoters of Brexit. In fact, he was probably the most senior Conservative leader to advocate this position. And yes, among the reasons, Johnson also talked about immigration and border control. Take a look.
For me, this is a question of democracy. It's about public consent and explaining to people. And the moment we have absolutely no power to control our immigration.
What's more, Johnson insisted again and again that remaining part of the European Union meant giving up any control over the border.
It is deeply corrosive to popular confidence in democracy that every year UK politicians tell the public they can reduce immigration by tens of thousands, and then find they miss their targets by hundreds of thousands. Boris Johnson, May 2016.
Now, this was not to say that Johnson was an anti-immigration leader or anything of the sort. No, he was simply saying that he did not agree with the uncontrolled arrival of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people every year. But at the same time, he also said things like this.
Boris Johnson says low immigration could lead to economic stagnation.
Be that as it may, at the time, Johnson was the mayor of London, and although it was already clear that his goal was to get to 10 Downing Street, he had to wait. Following the resignation of David Cameron, who had campaigned to remain in the European Union, his foreign minister, Theresa May, took over the helm. And May failed miserably in managing the negotiations to complete Brexit. Her resignation handed the leadership of the government to Boris Johnson in July of 2019. So one of the first things the new British Prime Minister did was to start working precisely on the migration issue. And so, in March 2021, his government presented a new plan for immigration policy, a plan that ultimately became a bill presented to the House of Commons at the end of June 2021 and passed in April 2022. We will look at that in more detail in a moment. And yes, for almost a decade now, British politics has been practically obsessed with this issue. However, if we take into account the arrival of foreigners, during the Johnson period, things did not change much, except for the fact that immigration shot up even more. For example, we can take a look at what happened with the refugees. As you can see, in 2019, the British authorities approved 70% more applications. And after the pandemic, the numbers grew even more. And this was just one example, because the truth is that work visas also skyrocketed from the time that Johnson took office. Almost 70% more were granted in 2022 than in 2016, the year of the referendum. See for yourself. So the question that begs to be asked is, what on earth happened? Wasn't Brexit supposed to be about limiting immigration? Wasn't Johnson a strong advocate of border control? Has the UK become an open door model? Well, having asked the questions, let's get to the answers.
Game change.
The United Kingdom, like the rest of Europe, has a massive need for a young workforce. That's because our population is getting older and older, but also because companies need very different profiles. From those oriented towards low-skilled jobs with very little added value, which the British no longer want to do, to those highly specialized profiles that are essential for the most cutting-edge industries, for example, for the technology industry, or for the very important British financial industry. So Johnson arrived at 10 Downing Street with this contradiction on his hands. On the one hand, he was supposed to fulfill the Brexit promises and bring forward a reform that would order and reduce the arrival of foreigners. But on the other hand, it had to be a reform that would not be a hindrance to the national economy. And the question is, what do you think happened? Well, we've already seen it. The data leaves us in no doubt. And you know what's strange? That all this didn't particularly erode Johnson's popularity. Suddenly, what was such an absolutely crucial issue, to the point of bringing about the exit from the European Union, became, well, something less significant. In fact, according to a study prepared by the Institute of Politics at King's College London, since Brexit, the rejection of the British towards foreign workers has collapsed. A different trend to what is happening in countries such as Australia or Canada. Don't say it's not paradoxical. The British seem to be becoming much more open and receptive in the immediate aftermath of leaving the European Union, despite the fact that the main electoral motive of the pro-Brexit camp was precisely to shut down and drastically reduce the influx of foreigners, which is exactly the opposite of what is happening. What's more, neither has the increase in immigration particularly eroded the government, nor do the British seem upset. And keep in mind that the rejection of immigrants has plummeted among all age groups. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about Generation Z, millennials, baby boomers, or the pre-war generation. In fact, in the latter case, rejection has plummeted by less than half in recent years, to just 8%. So the logical question is why? Probably because of this. The British economy is not going through its best time, but even so, the unemployment rate is very low, and there are many professions with huge shortages of workers. And this explains why, for instance, according to a recent Ipsos survey, Britons are keen to see more doctors, nurses, and even farmers coming to the country. In fact, less than 20% of Britons now want to see a reduction in the influx of professionals from virtually any activity. Interestingly, the only exception is bankers. But it is clear that this phobia has much more to do with banks than bank workers. And that's not all. The same Ipsos survey shows that 46% of Britons rate the impact of immigration positively, compared to 29% who rate it negatively. A negative perception that, curiously, has not stopped dropping since precisely 2016. In other words, now that many more immigrants are arriving, the British are no longer worried. Of course, the British public is one thing, and politicians are another. The current Conservative government is pushing ahead with a reform of immigration law that is so controversial that it has even been brought before the European Court of Human Rights. Do you want to know what I'm talking about? Well, let's take a look.
Playing with fire?
As it stands, the British may not care much about the immigration issue anymore, but at the same time, the politicians are still going strong. In April 2022, the Johnson administration succeeded in getting its new immigration plan approved. For example, the new law introduced a two-tier system that offered refugees different levels of protection depending on how they entered the UK. Those entering via safe and legal routes were granted permission to stay unconditionally, but those entering irregularly could only apply for a temporary stay of 30 months. And not only only that, the reform also sought to give the British Navy control of the territorial waters of the English Channel, and to be in charge of controlling immigration via that route. On top of that, this other possibility was included.
If they go down that road, if they cross the English Channel illegally in those boats, they risk ending up not in the UK, but in Rwanda. Boris Johnson.
Yeah, you heard that correctly. To combat illegal immigration, the Johnson government reached an agreement with Rwanda to receive all immigrants who were not accepted by the United Kingdom. Basically, the British authorities would refer to the African country all those people with rejected applications who were deemed ineligible or who were living in the country illegally. Well, the first flight under this new mass deportation plan was scheduled for 14th of June 2022, but had to be suspended following an injunction from the European Court of Human Rights, as the British idea seemed to clash with multiple international conventions. What's more, there are serious doubts that it's the best option.
Rwanda's history of receiving deportees raises concerns for a potential UK scheme. Of about 4,000 people estimated to have been deported by Israel to Rwanda and Uganda under a voluntary departure scheme between 2014 and 2017, almost all are thought to have left the country almost immediately, without many attempting to return to Europe via people smuggling routes.
For its part, Australia's experience, which for years has done something very similar with illegal immigrants, has also aroused much criticism and many doubts.
Nauru refugees, the island where children lost the will to live. We have started to see suicidal behavior in children as young as 8 and 10 years old, says Louise Newman, a professor of psychiatry at the University of Melbourne, Australia, who works with families and children on the island.
The fact is that the government crises of first Boris Johnson and then Liz Truss halted the Rwandan alternative. Despite this, and despite all the criticism, we can say that Johnson had a reasonably open-minded position, at least if we compare it with the current situation, because now there's a new government. And guess what? Rishi Sunak's team has plunged into a huge parliamentary battle to push through its own reform of the same law that was already amended just over a year ago at the behest of Boris Johnson's government. And they are from the same party. The most curious thing is that despite the fact that the British rejection of the arrival of immigrants and refugees has plummeted, Sunak's government wants to tighten Johnson's law. For example, that law allowed refugees who entered the country irregularly to qualify for a 30-month permit to stay. Now, the British government's objective is to prevent any person who enters irregularly from obtaining any permit or residency status, not even refugee status. Sunak's idea is that if you enter the country irregularly, neither you nor your children will be able to get any kind of residence permit. The spirit is that if you enter irregularly, whatever your status, you will face detention and deportation.
The bill will radically overhaul how we deal with people who arrive in the UK illegally via safe countries, rendering their asylum and human rights claims in respect of their home country inadmissible and imposing a duty on the Home Secretary to remove them. Robert Jenrick, Minister of State for Immigration.
And keep in mind, this basically means abolishing the concept of political asylum. The United Kingdom would no longer be a possible destination for people who are forced to leave their countries as soon as possible because they are being persecuted. It is true that there is a lot of fraud, but obviously in many situations, if your life or freedom are in imminent danger, for example, because of political ideas or for defending democracy, you're not going to go through bureaucratic procedures that could take years. Well, Sunak's plan would have none of that in mind. This is one of the main criticisms of a policy bet that, as you can see, is very strict, much more so than Johnson's gamble. But that's not all. Right here is where it gets particularly raw. Now, the Sunak government has doubled down and has already made the Rwanda deal official, despite the fact that, according to polls, the majority of Britons are against it.
The objective of this arrangement is to create a mechanism for the relocation of asylum seekers whose claims are not being considered by the United Kingdom to Rwanda, which will process their claims and settle or remove, as appropriate, individuals after their claim is decided. Memorandum of Understanding between the government of Rwanda and the government of the United Kingdom.
And the question is the big question: if the British public apparently don't have so much of a problem with immigration anymore, and if they are against deporting people to Rwanda, why this political bent? Basically, because of this.
6 May local elections 2023. Labour overtakes Conservatives as largest party of local government.
The pandemic, Johnson's fall, the Liz Truss crisis, inflation, rising rates, the state of the economy. The Conservative Party is facing a tough electoral crisis. As you can see in this chart, the polls are clear. For the next election in 2025, Labour currently seems to be the clear favourite. And the question you may be asking is, what role does immigration play in all of this? Basically, everything indicates that the Sunak government wants to turn immigration back into one of its major workhorses. In other words, the government may want to bring this issue back into the limelight to show toughness and force. It is something that worked for the Conservatives in the past, and so now they seem to want to try it again. And that is precisely why they are launching particularly tough messages and initiatives, such as confining illegal immigrants in a huge boat.
7th August 2023, Britain begins detaining migrants on barge firefighters called Death Trap.
Or make announcements like this one.
I've increased raids by 50% to clamp down on illegal workers. I saw firsthand the impact this will have in deterring people from coming here when I joined immigration enforcement officers last month for what was the biggest ever single day of raids.
Turning all this into some kind of show and publicity campaign doesn't seem like the best way to deal with this problem. Of course, this is essentially being done with refugees and illegal immigrants. Because when it comes down to it, the UK is likely to continue issuing as many work permits as it has been doing so far. After all, if one thing is clear, it is that the British economy is going to continue to need a lot of new labour. In other words, beyond the importance of discouraging illegal immigration, or whether or not there is room for improvement in the British immigration system, there are many suspicions that the latest legal changes may be primarily electoral in nature. With all the problems the UK has, this does not seem like a sensible priority. Be that as it may, at this point, it's your turn. What do you think of Sunak's political bet? Do you agree with the deportations to Rwanda? What do you think of such initiatives? As always, leave your impressions in the comments and let's open a debate. Now, if you found the video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you have not already done so. All the best. See you next time.